After my husband passed away, my daughter said, "You don't contribute anything. You eat here for free." I just smiled. "Hi, welcome to my channel. Thanks for being here. Enjoy my new story."
My daughter looked me straight in the eyes in front of her children and her husband and said, "You don't need to contribute anything here. You just get to eat for free." I didn't argue. I stood up, placed my napkin on the table, and walked out without a word. But they had no idea their evil deeds were about to be exposed, and the price would be devastating. Welcome, and I'm glad you found this. Like, subscribe and comment where you're watching from tonight. If someone has ever made you feel invisible, type "I understand" below. This is fictional, but the emotions are real. Are you ready? My son called me a burden without ever using that word. That's the thing about certain kinds of cruelty, they don't announce themselves. They don't come with raised voices or slammed doors. They arrive quietly, dressed up as casual conversation slipped in between the dinner rolls and the sweet tea. And by the time you realize what just happened, the moment has already passed, and everyone has moved on, and you're sitting there wondering if you imagined it. I didn't imagine it. It was a Friday evening in May, and the light coming through the dining room windows of Natalie and Derek's house in Charleston had that particular golden quality it gets in the South. This time of year, warm and slow. The kind of light that makes everything look prettier than it is. The table was set nicely. Roast chicken, green beans from the farmer's market, or so Natalie had mentioned twice. A candle in the center that nobody had lit. We were 4 adults and 2 children arranged around a rectangular table, doing what families do, passing dishes, asking about school, pretending that everything was fine. Juniper, my 10-year-old granddaughter, was telling me about a bird she'd spotted near the school playground. A painted bunting, she thought. I told her that was a lucky sighting, that painted buntings were shy birds, that they didn't show themselves to just anyone. She smiled at that. Sullivan, who was 7 and mostly concerned with whether there was enough butter for his roll, wasn't paying attention to either of us. That was when Natalie said it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at me with any particular expression, not contempt, not frustration, not even the vague pity I'd grown used to seeing on people's faces since Gerald passed. She just said it the way you'd state the weather, matter of fact, somewhere between a sigh and a sentence. "Mom, you don't really contribute anything here." The table didn't go silent, that's what I remember most. Derek kept cutting his chicken. Sullivan reached for the butter. Only Juniper stopped her fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes moving quickly to my face and then away, the way a child does when they sense something has shifted, but don't yet have the language for what it is. I set my napkin on the table. I said, "Excuse me for a moment," in the same tone I'd used for 40 years when I needed to collect myself, the voice I'd learned as a school librarian, the one that gave nothing away. And I walked out of the dining room. The hallway was dark. I hadn't turned the light on, and I didn't want to. There's something about standing in a dark hallway that makes it easier to think, no distractions, no faces to read. Just the particular silence of a house where people are still eating dinner 20 feet away and pretending the woman who just left the room will be back in a moment and everything will continue as before. I stood there with my back against the wall and my hand in the pocket of my cardigan. My fingers found it before I was even looking for it, that small rectangular piece of cardstock, soft at the corners now from years of being carried and forgotten and carried again. Gerald had pressed it into my hand on a Sunday afternoon, must have been 4 or 5 years before he left us. We were sitting at the kitchen table in our house on Oleander Street, and he'd slid it across to me without much ceremony, the way he did everything quietly, deliberately, with a confidence that never needed an audience. "If you ever feel lost," he'd said, "call this man." I'd looked at the card, a name, an address on Broad Street right here in Charleston. I'd asked Gerald why we'd need a lawyer in Charleston when we lived in Savannah, and he'd given me that small smile he reserved for questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. "Just keep it," he said. "Promise me you'll keep it." I promised. I tucked it into my cardigan pocket that afternoon, and somewhere along the way, it became a habit, moving it from one cardigan to the next. This small paper talisman I didn't fully understand but couldn't bring myself to put down. Standing in that dark hallway, I turned it over between my fingers. I could hear the dinner continuing behind me, the soft clink of silverware. Derek's low voice saying something I couldn't make out. The particular silence of Juniper, who I suspected was listening very carefully to everything. I didn't call the number that night. I want to be clear about that because what happened next didn't happen because I was brave or quick or particularly clever. It happened because of Gerald, because of a piece of cardboard he'd handed me years ago on a Sunday afternoon. And because of the kind of man he was, the kind who saw things coming long before anyone else did, and who prepared quietly without fuss, without ever making you feel like you needed to be prepared. I stood in that hallway for a long time. Long enough for the dinner sounds to soften. Long enough for Sullivan to ask for dessert, I heard that clearly, and for Natalie to say there was ice cream in the freezer. Long enough to understand something I hadn't let myself understand in the 8 weeks since I'd moved into this house. I was not a guest here. I had been treating myself like one grateful for the room, careful about the groceries, apologizing for taking up space in a house I'd convinced myself I should feel lucky to be in. I had been behaving like a woman who owed something when in fact the debts in this house ran in a very different direction. I was not a guest. I closed my fingers around the card. I didn't know yet what was on the bank statement sitting in a drawer upstairs. I hadn't found it yet. I didn't know about the trust or the transfers or what Gerald had quietly built and hidden and left for exactly this kind of moment. But something had shifted in me there in that dark hallway with the silverware still clinking softly behind me. I just didn't know yet how deep it went. To understand why those words hurt the way they did, you have to know what Gerald and I built, not what we owned. Not what we accumulated, what we built, which is a different thing entirely, and I think most people who've been married long enough know the difference. We built it on Oleander Street in a red brick house in Savannah, Georgia, with a front porch that faced west so we could watch the evening come in, and a kitchen that smelled like coffee from 6 in the morning until the pot ran dry. We built it over 45 years of ordinary Tuesdays and extraordinary Saturdays, and every kind of day in between. We built it out of the stuff that doesn't photograph, well, the inside jokes that stop needing a punchline. The way Gerald knew to bring me tea without being asked when I'd had a hard day at the library, the particular silence between two people who have nothing left to prove to each other. That's what we built. And if you've never had that, I'm not sure I can explain what it cost to have someone suggest it was nothing. Gerald planted the magnolia tree in the spring of 1982, the year Natalie was born. He did it the way he did most things without announcement, without ceremony, just a hole in the ground and a sapling he'd driven 40 minutes to find because he wanted a specific variety, one that bloomed late in the season when everything else had already finished showing off. He came inside with dirt on his knees and said, "It'll take about 10 years to really get going." I asked him why he'd picked something that took so long. He said, "Because we're not going anywhere." That was Gerald Harmon in a sentence. The man had the patience of someone who genuinely believed in the future. He worked for Chatham County for 35 years as a civil engineer, roads, bridges, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure that holds a city together without anyone noticing it's there. He retired in 2010 at 60 years old with a handshake and a certificate and a pension he was quietly proud of. He wasn't a wealthy man by any conventional measure. But he was meticulous in the way that certain men of his generation are meticulous, not anxious, not controlling, just deeply, genuinely careful. He had a gray metal cabinet in the corner of his home office, locked. 2 keys, one on his keyring, one in an envelope taped to the inside of his sock drawer, which he showed me exactly once and said, "You know where it is now." Inside that cabinet were folders for everything: the house deed, the car titles, insurance policies, tax returns, going back to 1978 receipts for appliances that no longer existed, a copy of both our wills and things I probably still don't know about because I never needed to look. Gerald believed that the difference between a family that survived hard times and a family that didn't was usually paperwork. I used to tease him about it. I'd say, "Gerald, you keep receipts for the lawnmower like it's going to testify in court someday." He'd just smile and say, "You laugh now." It was a Sunday evening. I couldn't tell you the year exactly, but Natalie was already grown, already living in Columbia at the time when Gerald sat down across from me at the kitchen table and took both my hands in his. He didn't do that often. Gerald was affectionate, but not theatrical about it, and when he reached for both your hands, it meant he was about to say something he'd been carrying for a while. He said, "If I go first, and I might, Beverly, one of us always does, don't let anyone rush you into anything. Not with the house, not with money, not with where you live. You take your time. You think clearly, and when you're ready, you call Davenport." I asked him who that was. "A man I trust," he said. "That's all you need to know right now." I should have pushed. I know that now. I should have asked for the full name, the phone number, the context, all the things a practical woman asks when her husband hands her a piece of information wrapped in mystery. But the truth is, with Gerald, I never felt the urgency that information usually requires. He had a way of making you feel like everything was accounted for, like he'd already walked the road ahead and marked the path, and all you had to do was trust the markers. So I didn't ask. I just nodded, and he squeezed my hands once and let go, and we sat there for a while longer in the kitchen with the window open and the Georgia evening coming in soft and warm. That was how Gerald loved me, not loudly, not with grand gestures, with 35 years of careful work and a locked gray cabinet and a name whispered at a kitchen table on a Sunday night. I think about that kitchen table now, and I understand things I didn't understand then. I understand that the magnolia tree wasn't just a tree. I understand that the gray cabinet wasn't just organization. I understand that "don't let anyone rush you" wasn't just a general piece of wisdom from a careful man. He was preparing something. He had been for years, quietly and without fuss, the way he built everything with patience, with precision, and with the long view firmly in mind. I had the life. I had the love. What I didn't have yet was the full picture of what he'd left behind for me to find. November came the way it always does in Savannah, quietly with cool air and yellow leaves. Gerald left the same way. I've thought about that a great deal in the months since. How fitting it was in a way I didn't appreciate at the time that a man who had lived his entire life without drama or spectacle would leave it the same way. No warning. No long goodbye. Just a Tuesday morning and then an absence that filled every room in the house without making a single sound. He was in his chair in the sitting room, reading the paper same as always, local section first, then national, then the crossword. He never quite finished, but always attempted. I was in the kitchen. I was thinking about whether we needed more coffee, which is the kind of thing you think about on an ordinary Tuesday morning, which is what that morning was, until it wasn't. By noon, he was no longer with me. I won't dwell on the details of those first hours because they belong to a part of my life I keep private. What I will tell you is that the neighbor who found him a retired school teacher from 2 doors down stayed with me until Natalie arrived, and I have never forgotten that kindness. The kindness of simply being present when there is nothing useful left to do is something I understand differently now than I did before. Now I think it might be the most useful thing there is. The grief came in like fog. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Not a wave people always say wave like it's something that knocks you down and then recedes. This was different. This was a slow total change in the quality of the air itself. It settled into the house on Oleander Street, and it settled into me, and for a very long time I could not tell where one ended and the other began. I stopped reading. 31 years as a school librarian, and suddenly I could not hold a page in my mind long enough for it to mean anything. I would sit down with a book and read the same paragraph over and over, the words slipping away each time, like water through cupped hands. I stopped cooking real meals. I moved through the days in a state that wasn't quite sleeping and wasn't quite waking, doing the minimum required to keep myself upright and nothing more. And the mail arrived. It came steadily the way mail does after a person leaves envelopes from the bank letters from financial institutions. Something from a law office in Charleston whose name I registered only long enough to set the envelope on the table with the others. I told myself I would deal with it when I felt more like myself. I told myself that every day for weeks. The pile on the dining room table grew slowly the way things grow when no one is watching them. I did not open a single envelope. Natalie called every other day. I want to say this carefully because I believe in being honest about complicated things. She was grieving too. Gerald was her father. Whatever I've learned about the months that followed, I have never once doubted that her love for him was real, and that losing him hurt her in ways she carried quietly. But there was something else underneath her calls, something I couldn't name at the time, couldn't see clearly through the fog. She would ask if I was eating, ask if I was sleeping, and then almost before I'd answered, she would say it, the same phrase every call with the same particular certainty. Mom, you can't stay in that house alone. Not a question, not a suggestion, a conclusion she had already reached. I didn't argue. Arguing required a kind of energy I didn't have required me to feel strongly enough about something to push back against it. And the fog had taken most of my strong feelings, along with everything else. I said I was fine. She said she was worried. We went around that circle until it became simply the shape of our conversations, and I stopped noticing I was walking it. Gerald's reading glasses stayed on the side table where he'd left them. I moved them once, set them on the bookshelf because I thought maybe it would help. Not having them right there, and then move them back the same evening because their absence was worse than their presence. That's the thing about grief that nobody warns you about. It's not the reminders that are hard. It's the removing of them. I sat with those glasses in my lap more nights than I can count. The name Davenport never entered my mind, not once. Gerald had given it to me like an anchor, and when the storm actually arrived, I forgot I had it entirely. That's what those months did to me. They took the practical and made it unreachable. The information was somewhere in my memory, but I couldn't get to it any more than I could get to the woman I'd been before November. The one who read a book a week and asked questions and knew, without having to think about it, exactly who she was and what she was owed. That woman had gone quiet. I know now what I didn't know then. Grief had made me soft in the places where I needed to be clear. It had taken the part of me that asked questions and folded it away somewhere I couldn't find, and I had let it happen day after day, envelope after envelope. I didn't open them, not one. Not the bank letters, not the financial notices, not the envelope from the law office in Charleston, whose name I'd already forgotten by the time it hit the pile. I didn't ask questions. I didn't pick up the phone and call anyone who might have helped me understand what was happening in the background of my own life while I sat in a quiet house and waited to feel like myself again. And the silence, I allowed the long, accommodating silence of a woman too deep in grief to think straight. That silence was not free. I know that now. I didn't know it then. February in Savannah is magnolia season. That was the month Natalie showed up with a moving plan already made. I remember the morning clearly. The blooms on the old tree in the front yard had just opened wide, white, and unapologetic, the way they always were in February, indifferent to whatever was happening in the house behind them. I had been watching them from the porch all week, the way I watched most things that winter, quietly from a distance, with the particular attention of a person who has too much time and not enough to fill it with. I was sitting on the porch with my second cup of coffee when her car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out wearing a blue cardigan I'd given her 2 Christmases ago, and for a moment she looked so much like the girl I'd raised that my chest ached in the best possible way. "Mom," she hugged me longer than usual, "I've been so worried about you." And just like that, I let my guard down. She'd driven up from Charleston by herself. Derek had stayed behind work, she said, but he'd sent along a folder. A neat tabbed folder with papers inside. I noticed it sitting on my kitchen counter before I noticed much else. It was the kind of folder that announces its own seriousness, color-coded tabs pages in plastic sleeves, everything arranged so that the conversation would go in a particular direction before it had properly begun. "He put together some information," Natalie said in that brisk, practical tone she'd inherited from Gerald, "about the logistics, the move, the paperwork for the house." I poured her a cup of coffee and told her to slow down. She didn't slow down. The folder contained a hand-drawn layout of their spare bedroom in Charleston. Derek had mapped out where my dresser would go, where the reading chair would fit, which closet I'd have. It was thoughtful in the way that leaves no room for questions. Everything had already been decided, measured, accounted for. All I had to do was agree. There was something both touching and unsettling about that level of preparation, the care it implied, and the assumption underneath the care. "You can't stay here alone, Mom," Natalie said. "This house is too big. The yard is too much. What if something happens and there's no one around?" I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The azaleas were coming in early this year. Gerald had planted those along the fence the spring after we moved in on a Saturday morning when Natalie was still in diapers, using a shovel with a cracked handle that he'd refused to replace because it still worked fine. "I've been alone here for 3 months," I said. "I know." She reached across the table and took my hand, and that's 3 months too many. I want to be fair to myself when I tell this part of the story. I wasn't foolish. I wasn't senile. I was tired, the specific kind of tired that settles into your bones, after months of sleeping in a house that used to hold 2 people and now only holds 1. The kind of tired that makes silence feel louder than it should and makes every ordinary task, making coffee for one, setting one place at the table. Turning off lights in rooms no one has been in feel like a small indignity. When your daughter sits across from you with love in her eyes and a plan in her hand, and all you'd have to do to feel less alone is say yes, it takes a particular kind of strength to say, wait. I didn't have that strength yet, so I said yes. Derek came up the following weekend with a truck and 2 men he'd hired. He was efficient and friendly the way he always was when something was being accomplished. He shook my hand, called me Beverly instead of Mom, the way he sometimes did when he was in a business frame of mind and got straight to work. By noon, the living room was half empty. By 3, the truck was loaded. He moved through the house like a man checking items off a list, and I suppose that was exactly what he was doing. The house sold fast. Derek said he had a contact, a buyer who'd been looking in the neighborhood, someone who could move quickly if the price was right. He set the number at $340,000. I remember thinking it sounded fair. I remember thinking Gerald would have researched it more carefully. Gerald would have looked up comparable sales on the street, called 2 or 3 agents for opinions, sat with the number for a week before agreeing. But Gerald wasn't there, and I had already said yes to the larger thing, so the smaller things followed naturally. "I'll handle all the paperwork," Derek said, spreading documents across the dining room table, the same table where Gerald's unopened letters had sat for months. "Just sign where I've marked." I signed where he'd marked. It took less than 20 minutes. The proceeds, he explained, would go into an account he'd help me manage, so you don't have to worry about transfers and tax forms and all that. He said it gently, like he was doing me a favor the way you explain something to someone who is capable of understanding, but would prefer not to be bothered. He said I'd have access whenever I needed. He used the word "we" a lot, which I found comforting at the time. I found it less comforting later. Before we left, I walked through every room by myself. The kitchen, where Gerald and I had made Sunday breakfasts for 45 years, the same cast iron skillet, the same window above the sink that let in the morning light at just the right angle in October. The hallway where Natalie had measured her height against the doorframe until she was 17, each mark penciled in with a date in Gerald's handwriting. The corner of the living room where the gray cabinet had stood, Derek had already loaded it into the truck along with the file boxes and the stack of unopened envelopes from the dining room. "I'll sort through all that once we're settled," he told me. "Get it organized properly." I nodded. I stood in the empty corner where the cabinet had been and looked at the slight impression in the carpet where its feet had rested for decades, and I told myself it was just furniture. It was just paper. I trusted him with the files the way I had trusted Natalie with the move because I was tired and because trusting someone felt easier than understanding everything myself. That was my mistake. Not the trusting I still believe in trusting people. The mistake was trusting without asking a single question first. There is a difference between faith and abdication, and I had spent enough years watching Gerald navigate that line to know better. I simply hadn't been paying attention to which side of it I was standing on. The drive to Charleston took just over 2 hours. I sat in the passenger seat of Natalie's car watching Savannah fall away behind us, the moss-draped oaks, the brick sidewalks, the neighborhood I had called home for most of my adult life. Natalie talked about the guest room, about the neighborhood near their house, about a farmer's market on Saturday mornings that she thought I'd love. Her voice was warm and certain the way it gets when she's decided something is going to be fine and has chosen to believe it fully. I listened. I watched the road. And when we crossed the state line into South Carolina, I turned and looked back through the rear window at nothing in particular. The last thing I saw before Savannah disappeared completely was the pale flash of a magnolia bloom, or maybe I only imagined it. Either way, I held on to it. I arrived in Charleston carrying the weight of $340,000 I could not touch, and a stack of letters I had never read. I told myself it would all work out. I told myself Natalie needed me close, and that mattered more than anything else. Looking back now, I understand what that moment really was. It wasn't a daughter helping her mother. It wasn't a fresh start. It was the moment I handed over the keys not just to a house, but to every decision that came after. And I did it willingly because I was too worn down to ask what I was really signing. The guest room had a window that faced east. Every morning light came in whether I wanted it to or not. In Savannah, I had always woken up on my own terms. The bedroom Gerald and I shared faced west, and the mornings there were slow and gentle dim until nearly 8. The kind of light that eased you into the day rather than demanding you show up for it. The curtains were ones I had chosen myself a cream linen that softened everything, and the room smelled of the cedar sachets I kept in the dresser drawers. In Charleston, the sun arrived at 6:15, like an appointment I hadn't made, filling the room with a brightness that felt less like welcome and more like an inspection. The curtains here were white cotton, thin and cooperative, and they did nothing to stop it. I told myself it would take time to adjust. 3 weeks in, I was still telling myself that. The house on Briarwood Lane ran on Derek's schedule. That much became clear within the first few days. Dinner was at 6:30, not 6, not 7. 6:30. The thermostat was set to 68 degrees and remained there regardless of whether I was cold, which I almost always was. I had taken to keeping a cardigan on the back of the reading chair in my room and putting it on before I came downstairs each morning, the way you dress for weather you've learned to expect. The grocery list lived on a notepad by the refrigerator, and items were to be added in the appropriate category: produce, dairy, dry goods, not written wherever there was space. I discovered this the second week when I added decaf coffee at the bottom of the list in the wrong section and found it moved without comment to its correct place by the following morning. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just how some households ran. There were people who found order in systems and systems in order, and perhaps that was simply Derek's way of managing a full house. I had known organized men before. Gerald had been organized. But Gerald's organization had always made room for other people inside it. What I was learning about Derek's was that it didn't. The first moment that made me pause was a Tuesday in late March. Natalie and I had taken Juniper to get new school supplies, a field trip, just the three of us. The kind of easy afternoon that reminded me of when Natalie was small and we'd wander the aisles of a store without any particular hurry. There had been a 5 and dime near our house on Oleander Street, and Natalie used to save her birthday money for weeks just to spend it slowly in those aisles. She had always known exactly what she wanted. That had been one of the things I loved most about her at that age, the certainty of her. At the register, Juniper put a set of colored markers on the counter, and Natalie reached into her purse. She came up empty. Not because she'd forgotten her wallet, I could see the wallet in her bag. She reached past it and pulled out a card I recognized as Derek's, a single card in a small sleeve tucked separately from everything else she carried. She handed it over without comment, the way you hand over something you've been handing over for so long it no longer requires thought. I didn't say anything then either, but I filed it away the way Gerald had always told me to file things that didn't make sense yet, quietly for later. That evening, while Juniper was in the bath, I asked Natalie about it, lightly the way you ask about something when you're hoping to be told you misunderstood. "Oh, Derek handles all of that," she said with a small laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's just easier, one account, one card, less confusion." "Do you have your own account?" I asked. She smiled and changed the subject. I let her. But the smile had the quality of a door closing, politely not slammed, just eased shut, and I noted that too. What kept me from sinking entirely in those weeks was the children. Juniper had discovered that I would read with her after school, not to her, but with her trading paragraphs back and forth, the way her teachers apparently didn't have time for anymore. She'd appear at my door around 4 o'clock with a book already selected, climb into the reading chair by the window, and hand me my half without a word, as though this had always been our arrangement. She was the kind of reader who moved her lips slightly on the difficult words and didn't seem embarrassed about it, which I found quietly endearing. Some afternoons that hour was the only part of the day that felt like mine. Sullivan was quieter about it, but no less steady. He was 7 more serious than most 7-year-olds I had known, and he expressed himself the way some people do, not in words, but in small, deliberate gestures. 3 or 4 times a week, I'd find a folded piece of paper that had been slid under my door overnight. Crayon drawings, mostly. Our house in Savannah, or what he imagined it looked like based on photographs he'd seen. A tree with big white flowers. A woman sitting on a porch. Once a drawing of 2 people at a kitchen table, one tall and one small with a mug between them that he had colored very carefully in brown. He never signed them. He didn't need to. It was a Wednesday night in early April when I heard it. I had come downstairs for a glass of water, couldn't sleep, which had become its own kind of routine, and the kitchen light was still on. Derek and Natalie were at the counter, voices low, the kind of low that people use when they want to speak privately, in a house that isn't quite big enough for privacy. I stopped in the hallway. "She hasn't put in anything for groceries," Derek was saying. "We're 3 months in." Not angry. That would have been easier to dismiss. His voice had no heat in it at all. It was the voice he used for calculations, for logistics, for things that needed to be corrected. The same voice he used when discussing the thermostat. The same voice he used for the grocery list. "She doesn't have easy access to her account right now," Natalie said quietly. "You know that." "Then we need to figure something out," he said. "It's not sustainable." A pause. Then, "I'll talk to her." I backed away from the doorway and returned to my room without my water. I lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Gerald came back to me then the way he often did in moments that needed him, and what came back specifically was something he'd said years ago about a man we'd both known. A neighbor on the far end of our street whose wife had handled all the finances, every dollar accounted for, every purchase explained. Gerald had watched that household for years with a quiet concern he rarely voiced directly. "A man who sees family as a ledger," he'd said one evening, setting down his coffee, "is missing something in his chest." I had laughed when he said it. I wasn't laughing now. I wasn't angry either, not exactly. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was something quieter and more unsettling, the slow recognition of what my position in this house actually was. Not a mother. Not a guest. Even guests have the option to leave, and leaving is understood to be their right. Something closer to an unpaid balance. A line item that hadn't been resolved yet. I thought about Natalie's smile when I'd asked about the account, the door easing shut. I thought about how long a person can live inside a system before they stop being able to see the walls. That was the night I stopped telling myself it would just take time to adjust. 7 weeks in, I had claimed exactly one thing as my own, the morning walk to the mailbox. It wasn't much a narrow brick path from the front door 22 steps to the street, then back again. The whole thing took less than 3 minutes, but it was mine. No one asked me to do it. No one told me not to. And for those 3 minutes, I was simply a woman, standing outside in the early morning air, listening to the neighborhood wake up a screen door somewhere, a sprinkler 2 houses down the particular quiet of a street that hasn't fully decided to begin yet. Derek usually got to the mail first. He was an early riser by habit, and by the time I came downstairs, most mornings, whatever had arrived the day before was already sorted and stacked on the corner of his desk. But that Tuesday morning in May, Derek had left before 6 for what Natalie called an early site visit, something about a contract downtown, and the mailbox was still closed when I came outside at 7 with my coffee. I opened it without thinking twice. There were 4 pieces of mail inside, a cable bill, a furniture catalog, something from a pediatrician's office addressed to Natalie, and an envelope standard business size, cream-colored, slightly thicker than the rest, addressed in clean block print to Beverly Harmon, care of 1140 Tidewater Lane, Charleston, SC 29401. The return address read First Coastal Bank of Georgia. I stood at the mailbox and looked at it for a moment. My name printed clearly with a forwarding address I had never given to any bank in Georgia. Someone had updated that information. Someone had made sure this letter would follow me here. I took it inside. The house was still quiet. Juniper and Sullivan wouldn't be up for another hour. Natalie was in the shower. I could hear the pipes. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Derek had spread out grocery lists and schedule notes for 7 weeks, and I opened the envelope carefully, the way Gerald had always opened important mail, with a butter knife along the top seam. Inside was a single form, 3 pages stapled. At the top, in formal typeface, Transfer Authorization Harmon Family Trust. I read the line beneath it twice. Requested transfer amount $380,000. Destination account, personal account on file. Authorization required from primary beneficiary. Below that, a signature line. Blank. With my name printed underneath it. Beverly Ann Harmon, primary beneficiary. I set the form down on the table. I picked it up again. I read it a third time slowly, the way you read something when you're hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something that makes more sense. They didn't. I had not known I was the primary beneficiary of anything. Gerald had mentioned the word trust once or twice over the years in the same easy, passing way. He mentioned the gray cabinet or the second set of house keys, and I had filed it away as one of those things he was taking care of. The way he took care of the insurance renewals and the property tax and the contractor who came every spring to check the roof. I trusted him to handle what needed handling. That had always been enough. It was not enough now. I turned the form over, checking for anything I might have missed. And there, tucked between the second and third pages, so small I almost didn't see it was a folded slip of paper. Not from the bank. Personal stationery, the kind Gerald had kept in the top drawer of the gray cabinet. The handwriting was as faded, the way his handwriting always faded on the notes he'd written years back, pressed too lightly with the pen he preferred. 4 lines, that was all. Beverly Prescott Davenport, 144 Broad Street, Charleston. He knows. I read those 4 lines more times than I can count. He knows. Not he can help, not call him when you're ready, just he knows. Which meant Gerald had already told him something, had already made some arrangement, planned some step I hadn't been part of and hadn't known to look for. The name Davenport had floated through our kitchen in Savannah years ago, like something half-remembered, a name without a face, and I had let it float past me the way I let so many practical things float past me when Gerald was alive, because he was always there to catch them. He wasn't here to catch anything now, but he had known somehow, the way Gerald always seemed to know, that a moment like this one would come. A morning when I would be alone at a kitchen table in a city that wasn't mine, holding a document I hadn't been shown with a signature line waiting for my name. He had left me a door. I sat with the note in my hands for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A cardinal landed on the windowsill outside and looked in at me, or seemed to, before lifting off again. $380,000. My name on a signature line. A man on Broad Street who already knew. Gerald had seen this coming from so far away that he'd had time to prepare for it. He'd had time to write the note, to fold it into the right envelope, to make sure it would find me. The question sitting in the center of my chest, quiet but unmistakable, was the same one I should have asked years ago. The same one I should have asked in February when Natalie arrived with her folder already tabbed and organized. What exactly is being transferred, and to whom? 2 days I sat with that envelope on my nightstand. 2 days I picked up my phone and put it back down. The first day I told myself I needed more time to think. The second day I told myself the same thing, which was how I knew I wasn't thinking at all. I was stalling. There's a difference, though. It took me until my early 70s to fully understand it. Thinking moves forward even slowly. Stalling just circles the same ground until the grass wears away. I'd written the address down on a notepad, 144 Broad Street, and set it on the nightstand beside the envelope. Every time I looked at it, something in me tightened. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling before a doctor's appointment when you already suspect what they might find. You want to know. You're not sure you're ready. Wednesday morning came gray and closed the way Charleston mornings sometimes do in May, when the heat hasn't quite decided to arrive yet. I was sitting on the edge of my bed with my coffee going cold on the nightstand when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Mrs. Harmon. The voice was Southern unhurried, the kind of voice that had been talking to people for a very long time and had learned there was no point in rushing. My name is Harriet Bloom. I'm calling from my personal phone, so this isn't an official call. I want to be clear about that up front. I set my coffee down. I work at First Coastal Bank of Georgia, the Charleston branch, she continued. I've been there going on 31 years, and I've got about 3 months left before I retire, which means I'm at the point in my career where I care a good deal more about what's right than what's procedure. All right, I said. It was all I could manage. I want to ask you something before I say anything else, Harriet said. Did you authorize any transfers out of an account associated with the Harmon Family Trust in the last 8 months? The room went very still. No, I said. I didn't know there was a trust with my name on it until 2 days ago. A pause, short but weighted. That's what I was afraid of, she said. Harriet Bloom, I would learn over the next several minutes, had known Gerald Harmon the way long-tenured bank employees sometimes come to know their most consistent customers not personally. Not socially, but in the particular way that comes from watching someone show up every quarter for over a decade, always prompt, always prepared, always with his paperwork in order. He came in every 3 months, she said. Regular as a clock, always had his documentation, always asked questions until he understood the answer. In 31 years, I have met maybe a dozen customers like that. She paused. When I saw his name flagged on a review file last week, I pulled the account history myself, and I asked. 8 transactions, she said. 8 separate months, each one just under $10,000. I waited. Mrs. Harmon, when someone makes repeated transfers in amounts just below the federal reporting threshold, that's not careful accounting. That's a pattern. And that pattern has a name, but what matters right now isn't the name. What matters is that whoever set those transactions up knew exactly what the threshold was and stayed just beneath it. 8 times! Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. That's not an accident. That's not a bookkeeping error. That's hiding. I stood up from the edge of the bed. I don't know why my legs just needed something to do. I've worked in banking long enough to know when something doesn't match the person whose name is on the account. Harriet continued. Gerald Harmon was meticulous. Whatever is moving through that trust right now, he didn't set it in motion. I'd stake 31 years on that. Who did? I asked. That's what you need to find out, she said. And you need to do it before that transfer authorization gets signed, because once that goes through, recovering anything becomes a much longer road. She let that settle for a moment. There's a man named Prescott Davenport, office on Broad Street. Do you have that name? Something moved through my chest, a warmth I hadn't expected in the middle of all this cold. I have his address, I said. For the first time in the conversation, Harriet Bloom's voice softened slightly. Good, she said. Gerald trusted him completely. That account was set up through his office 12 years ago. A brief pause. Go today, Mrs. Harmon. Don't wait another 2 days. How did you know I'd been waiting? I asked. Because that's what people do, she said. When they're hoping it'll turn out to be nothing. She said goodbye the way practical women do, no excess warmth, no reassurance she couldn't back up. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, I stood in the middle of my guest room and looked at the corner of the nightstand where Gerald's folded note had sat for 48 hours. He knows. That was all he'd written. And now a woman who had watched my husband walk through a bank door every quarter for over a decade had just told me in her own careful, unhurried way that he was right to have written it. For the first time since all of this had started to unravel, I didn't feel entirely alone in it. Someone else had seen what I was only beginning to name. Someone had looked at the same set of facts and arrived at the same quiet, unsettling conclusion. Something was wrong, and it had been wrong for a while. I picked up the notepad with the Broad Street address. I picked up my phone. This time I didn't put it back down. I dressed carefully that morning, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because walking into that office felt like the first real thing I'd done in months. Not the first important thing, the first real thing. The distinction matters. In the months since Gerald left, I had done plenty of things that looked real from the outside, packed boxes, signed papers, moved cities, set my coat in a closet that wasn't mine. But those had all been things that happened to me more or less. This was something I was choosing, something I was walking toward on my own 2 feet in my good navy cardigan with the address written on a notepad page folded in my coat pocket. I told Natalie I was going out for a walk. She looked up from her laptop, smiled, and said to take a jacket. I took a jacket. The cab let me out on Broad Street at 9:52. The office at 144 Broad Street was the kind that Charleston does particularly well, a narrow townhouse front, dark green paint brass numbers above the door. Inside, the ceilings ran high and the floors were wide planked oak the color of strong tea. It smelled of paper and wood and the particular stillness that settles into rooms where serious things have been discussed for a long time. A young woman at the front desk asked my name, made a small note, and said Mr. Davenport was expecting me. That stopped me for just a moment. Expecting me. Not available to see me. Not will be with you shortly. Expecting me the way you expect someone whose arrival has been anticipated for a while. Prescott Davenport was in his late 60s with the kind of unhurried manner that isn't learned in a day. He rose when I came in, shook my hand with both of his, and gestured to the chair across from his desk, a leather wingback that had clearly held many people through many difficult conversations and had the worn armrests to prove it. "Mrs. Harmon," he said, "I'm glad you came." "How long have you been expecting me?" I asked. He settled back in his chair and folded his hands. "Gerald set up a contact file in 2019, he said. "Instructions to be opened upon your first communication. He updated it in 2021. He paused briefly. He hoped you wouldn't need it for a long time, but he wanted to make sure it was here. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and let him continue. Prescott walked me through the Harmon Family Trust the way a good attorney walks you through something complicated, without rushing, without condescending, pausing when he saw me absorbing something. Gerald had established it in 2009, the year I turned 57. I had known something existed. I had not known what it contained or what it meant. "You are the primary beneficiary," Prescott said, "which is standard. What is not standard, what Gerald specifically requested, is a consent right clause." He turned a page in the folder on his desk. "Any distribution above $10,000 requires your written authorization, not a co-trustee's, not a family member acting on your behalf, yours." "Gerald put that in himself?" I asked. "He did. It was not a default provision. He asked for it by name." Prescott looked at me steadily. He was very clear about why. He said, and I'm quoting from the file, "Beverly trusts people too easily. That's one of the things I love most about her. It's also the thing that worries me." I looked down at my hands for a moment. Then Prescott opened a second folder. "I need to show you something," he said, and his tone shifted not dramatically, but enough that I straightened in my chair. "These are the transaction records for the past 8 months." He laid out a single page, 8 rows, 8 dates, 1 per month each, with a withdrawal amount: $9,800, $9,500, $9,750, $9,900, $9,600, $9,850, $9,700, $9,900. Each transaction falls below the federal reporting threshold of $10,000, Prescott said, which means no automatic flag, no review trigger. To someone scanning an account quickly, it looks like routine activity. He let me look at the numbers for a moment. The total across 8 months is just over $80,000. The room felt very quiet. The trust's total value at the time of Gerald's passing was approximately $520,000. He continued. The $80,000 has been moved to an account we have not yet fully identified. We're working on that. I looked at the 8 numbers on the page. Neat, deliberate, just under the line. Every single one. That's not accounting. That's hiding. Harriet had used almost the same words. Derek was added as a limited trustee in 2021. Prescott said, "At Natalie's request, his access was never meant to authorize large distributions. That consent right remains yours alone. But limited trustee status gave him enough standing to initiate these smaller transfers without triggering your signature requirement." He said it without accusation, just fact, just the shape of what had happened. Before I stood to leave, Prescott reached into his desk drawer and set an envelope on the desk between us. Cream-colored, sealed. Gerald's handwriting on the front, the careful, slightly left-leaning script I had watched fill grocery lists and birthday cards and engineering notes for 45 years. For Beverly, open when you're ready. He left this with me in 2019, Prescott said. Updated the contents in 2021. He was very specific that I give it to you in person after you'd heard everything else. He paused. I'd suggest you take the afternoon. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected. The cab back up Broad Street took 4 minutes. I didn't open the envelope in the cab. I held it in both hands in my lap and looked out the window at a city that had been going about its ordinary business all morning, while I sat in a room and learned what my husband had quietly arranged for me across a decade and a half. The sky was the pale, clear blue that Charleston saves for its better mornings. Everything looked the same as it had 2 hours ago. The storefronts, the wrought iron fences, the tourists taking photographs on the corner of Meeting Street. But it all looked slightly different, too. The way a familiar room looks different when someone hands you a lamp and says, "Here, you can see it properly now." I wasn't sure I was ready to see it all yet, but I was holding the lamp. I sat in my car on Broad Street for a long time before I opened it. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. That's the strange thing about letters written by people who are no longer here. The weight of them has nothing to do with the number of pages inside. It has to do with knowing that the voice on the other side of the paper chose every word deliberately knowing they would only get one chance to say it. Gerald had been a careful man. He would have rewritten this more than once. He would have read it aloud to himself in the gray cabinet room to hear how it sounded, then sat with it overnight before sealing it. I looked at my name on the front for a long moment. For Beverly, open when you're ready. I broke the seal slowly, the way you open something you want to last. 3 pages. His handwriting, the careful left-leaning script written with the same deliberate pace he brought to everything that mattered. No salutation. Gerald never believed in salutations for the things that counted. He had always said that dear was a word people used when they weren't sure how to begin, and that if you knew the person well enough, you could simply start. He started mid-thought the way he sometimes did when we talked at the kitchen table late at night, as though the conversation had already been going on for a while, and he was simply picking it up where it belonged. You're reading this because something has happened that I hoped wouldn't but planned for anyway. That's always been the difference between us. You hoped, and I planned. We needed both. In 2020, I bought a house, not in Savannah. Somewhere you'd never looked for one, in a place I think you'll love when you let yourself. 412 Ridgeline Drive, Black Mountain, North Carolina. It's a small town Beverly, the kind that still has a hardware store on the main street and a farmer's market on Saturday mornings, and neighbors who bring food when something hard happens. It's tucked into the Blue Ridge, 15 minutes from Asheville, if you need a city, but far enough away that the nights are quiet and the air comes in clean off the mountain. I paid for it in full out of the trust, $295,000. The deed is in your name alone, not in both our names, not in the trust's name. Yours. Nobody else's name is on that paper. Nobody else has a claim. The key is with Prescott. He'll give it to you when you're ready. I stopped reading. Outside the car, a couple walked by on the sidewalk, tourists, from the look of their shoes, moving at the slow, appreciative pace of people who have nowhere particular to be. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Someone's dog strained at a leash toward a palmetto tree. All of it completely ordinary. All of it completely unchanged. I looked back down at the page. I knew there might come a time when you'd need a place that was entirely yours. No permissions asked, no signatures required from anyone else, no arrangements that depended on someone else agreeing. Just a door with your name on it that opens when you turn the key. I want to tell you something I should have said more often while I was there to say it. You were always the one who made our house a home. I drew the plans and fixed the gutters and worried about the property taxes. You made it the kind of place people didn't want to leave. Natalie grew up safe because of that. I came home to it every evening for 45 years and never once took it for granted. I wanted to give you one last house that was only yours, not ours, not anyone's to negotiate or manage or sign away. Yours. Go when you're ready, not before. Don't let anyone rush you. The last line brought me up short. I had heard those words before, not in a letter, but spoken at the kitchen table in Savannah Gerald's hand over mine on an ordinary evening that hadn't seemed important at the time. Don't let anyone rush you. He'd said it once, and I'd thought it was general advice. Now I understood it had never been general at all. He had known in the specific practical Gerald Harmon way of knowing things that there would come a moment when someone would try. He had built an answer to that moment 10 years before the moment arrived. I read all 3 pages again, then a third time slower. I didn't cry right away. I've thought about that since why the tears didn't come in the car with 3 pages of my husband's handwriting in my lap. I think it was because grief and gratitude arrived at the same moment, and when they're equal in weight, they cancel each other out and leave something else in their place. Something steadier. What I felt sitting in that car on Broad Street on a Wednesday afternoon in May was not sadness. It was not even happiness exactly. It was orientation, the particular feeling of a compass needle settling. For the first time in more months than I wanted to count, I knew where I was going. Not today, not tomorrow, but the direction existed now, solid and real and entirely mine. A house on a hill in a small mountain town, with a key waiting at an office on Broad Street, and my name, only my name, on the deed. I folded the pages carefully along their original creases and set them back in the envelope. Then I sat for a little while longer watching Charleston go about its afternoon through the windshield and let the knowledge settle into me the way good news does when you've been waiting a long time without knowing what you were waiting for. 3 weeks passed. I watched. I listened. I learned the rhythms of that house the way you learn the sounds of a building settling at night, not because you're looking for anything in particular, but because your body starts paying attention before your mind gives it permission. I knew by then which floorboard outside Juniper's room creaked. I knew that Derek left his briefcase by the door when he was home for the evening and moved it to his office when he was planning to leave early the next morning. I knew that Natalie hummed to herself when she was content and went very quiet when she wasn't, and that she hadn't hummed in at least 2 weeks. I watched all of it and said nothing. There's a particular skill that comes with age, not wisdom, exactly just patience. The understanding that some information has to arrive in its own time, and the only thing rushing it accomplishes is making people close their doors. So I waited. I kept my observations to myself and my mornings to my 1 cup of coffee at the kitchen table before the house fully woke up. I wrote nothing down. I asked nothing directly. Then one Thursday afternoon in June, Juniper came to my room with her school project and changed everything. She knocked the way she always did, 2 short taps, then the door easing open before I could answer, which I had come to understand was simply her way. She was 10 years old and had not yet learned to disguise her feelings. Everything she thought moved across her face in real time, which made her both easy to love and easy to worry about. "Grandma, do you want to see my bird project?" She had been working on it for 2 weeks, a study of Georgia songbirds for her natural science class, illustrated by hand. She climbed onto the end of my bed without being invited, which she had done since she was small enough that I could carry her in one arm, and held her tablet out toward me. It was a good project. She had drawn a painted bunting with careful attention to color red and blue and green, layered in crayon over pencil sketch, and written 3 paragraphs about its migration patterns in handwriting that was already neater than mine had been at her age. "This is beautiful," I told her, and I meant it. She smiled the way children smile when they're pleased, but don't want to seem too pleased and swiped to the next page. She swiped too fast. Or maybe her finger caught the edge of something she hadn't meant to open. Either way, the project disappeared and something else filled the screen, a messaging thread. Names at the top I registered in the half-second before Juniper yanked the tablet back against her chest. Half a second was enough. I saw Natalie's name. I saw the name Claire beside it. And I saw 3 lines of text, not the whole conversation, just 3 lines, the last ones visible before the screen went dark. I feel completely trapped. Derek controls every dollar. I can't even buy Juniper's school shoes without asking him first. Juniper held the tablet face down in her lap and did not look at me. The room was very quiet. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower started up somewhere down the street, a slow, ordinary sound that had no business being there. "Grandma," Juniper said, still not looking up. Her voice was careful in the way that children's voices get when they are trying very hard to sound casual. "Don't tell Mom I showed you that." I reached over and put my hand on hers. "Just for a moment." "You didn't show me anything, sweetheart," I said. She looked up, then quickly checking my face, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once tucked the tablet under her arm and slid off the bed. "The painted bunting is my favorite," she said from the doorway, "in case you were going to ask." "I was going to ask," I said. She left. I sat in the room for a long time after the sound of her footsteps faded down the hall. The chair I was sitting in was one Gerald had picked out for our 40th anniversary, a low wingback in a faded blue-gray fabric, the kind of piece he'd spent 3 weeks researching before deciding on, because that was how he did everything. It had traveled with me from Savannah in the moving truck, the one thing I had specifically asked Derek not to pack himself. It had taken up residence in the corner of this room and become like the morning mailbox walk, one of the few things in this house that belonged entirely to me. I rested my hands on the worn arms of that chair and looked out the window at nothing in particular. What Juniper had not shown me, what I had not seen, was not anger. It wasn't a dramatic declaration or an accusation she was building toward. 3 lines sent to a friend named Claire in a private message that was never meant for anyone else. That was the most honest kind of testimony there was. The kind with no audience, no performance, no consideration of how it would land. I feel completely trapped. Not I'm having a hard time. Not things have been difficult lately. Trapped. A word you use when you've stopped expecting the situation to change on its own. I can't even buy Juniper's school shoes without asking him first. I thought about the day at the store, the wallet in her bag, the single card in the separate sleeve. I had filed that away for later the way Gerald always told me to file things that didn't make sense yet. Later had arrived. I sat in Gerald's chair as the afternoon light shifted through the curtain, and I understood something I hadn't let myself understand until now. This was not only about me and a trust and $80,000 that had quietly walked out a side door. It was about my daughter, too. The particular exhaustion in those 3 lines, the kind that belongs to someone who has spent a long time adjusting to a life with no room in it, was not new. It had been there for a while. Natalie hadn't written those words out of anger. She had written them the way people write things when they have simply run out of energy to pretend otherwise. The weariness of someone who has learned to call a cage a home. I had spent most of my life watching other people act. After what I saw on that tablet, I decided it was time to start paying a different kind of attention. Not the passive kind, the kind where you notice things and file them away and wait for someone more qualified to do something about them. I had been doing that for months, and all it had earned me was a guest room in a house where my name wasn't on anything, and my money was somewhere I couldn't see. The time for filing things away and waiting had passed. What I needed now was a record. Gerald had given me a small red notebook the previous Christmas, the last Christmas we had together, though I didn't know it then. It was the kind of gift he gave when he noticed something a good notebook for someone who needed to write things down. He handed it to me with a card that said in his straightforward way, "For the thoughts that matter." I had never opened it. It had traveled from Savannah to Charleston in a box with my reading glasses and a few paperbacks, and I had set it on the nightstand when I unpacked and not touched it since. I opened it the Friday morning after Juniper's visit. I wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then I began. I wrote down everything I had been carrying in my head for weeks. The thermostat held at 68, the single credit card in Natalie's bag, Derek's voice in the kitchen that Wednesday night. The 8 rows of numbers Prescott had shown me, the words on the messaging thread I was not supposed to have seen. I wrote it in plain sentences without editorializing the way Gerald had always kept his own notes facts, first interpretation later. It took me most of the morning. When I was finished, I had 4 pages filled front and back and a clearer picture of the last several months than I'd had at any point while living through them. Writing things down does that. It forces the scattered into a line. 2 days later, I walked 3 houses down the street. Velma Osgood had introduced herself the first week I arrived, appeared at the door with a jar of pickled okra, and the frank, unhurried manner of a woman who had long since stopped worrying about whether people found her too direct. She was 73, a retired county treasurer, twice widowed. and possessed of the particular sharpness that comes from spending 3 decades watching where money went and catching the places where it shouldn't have gone. We had shared coffee twice since that first meeting. I liked her because she didn't soften things she didn't need to soften, and because she had never once asked me how I was really doing in that careful voice people use when they expect you to cry. I brought the red notebook to her kitchen table. "I need someone to look at this," I said, "someone who understands financial patterns." Velma set down her coffee cup, reached for her reading glasses from the counter, and opened to the first page without a word. She read slowly. She did not react visibly, no sharp intake of breath, no shaking of the head, just a steady, methodical reading that reminded me of the way Gerald reviewed contracts. When she reached the last page, she went back and reread 2 sections. Then she took off her glasses and set them on the table. "Beverly," she said, "this money didn't go to a business." I waited. These transactions pattern like personal transfers. Regular intervals, consistent amounts just below the reporting threshold, no corresponding business documentation. She tapped the page with one finger. Someone is being supported. Not a vendor, not a contractor, not an investment. A person. The coffee between us had gone lukewarm. Neither of us moved to refresh it. "I had the same feeling," I said. "I just didn't have the vocabulary for it." "Now you do," Velma said. That afternoon, Prescott called. His office had completed the trace on the destination account, the one that had received 8 transfers over 8 months. He told me in the same careful, unhurried tone he used for everything the account was registered to a woman named Sandra Fielding address, listed in Columbia, South Carolina. The pattern of transfers, he said, was consistent with ongoing personal financial support. His office was preparing documentation. I thanked him. I told him I'd already expected something along those lines. After I hung up, I opened the red notebook to the last written page and uncapped my pen. I wrote the name, Sandra Fielding, Columbia, SC. Then I capped the pen, closed the notebook, and set it on the table in front of me. I sat for a while after that. The afternoon had gone quiet, that particular stillness of a weekday when the children are still at school, and the house holds its breath between the bustle of morning and evening. Down the hall, I could hear the faint sound of a ceiling fan. Upstairs, nothing. Natalie was in the kitchen when I had passed through 20 minutes earlier, moving methodically through a grocery list, one item at a time, the way she moved through most things in this house. Careful, measured, taking up just as much space as she'd been given permission to take. I told Velma on my way out that there were going to be important papers arriving soon. She nodded the way practical people nod when they already know the shape of what's coming. I walked back down the street to the house on Briarwood Lane and sat down with my red notebook and thought about my daughter. She was at the other end of the hall, separated from me by 30 feet of hardwood floor and a closed door, and she had no idea that a woman named Sandra Fielding existed. She had no idea that the account managing every dollar of her household had been quietly bleeding into South Carolina for the better part of a year. She thought that was simply how a marriage worked, one person in charge of the money, one person asking permission for school shoes. I had not cried when Prescott told me the name. I had not felt the hot rush of anger I might have expected. What I felt was something quieter and more purposeful, the specific clarity of a woman who has gathered enough information to know that she is not confused, not overreacting, not imagining things. I had known enough for a while, if I was honest. Now I had it written down. The doorbell rang at 7:45 the next morning before Derek had left for work, before the coffee had finished brewing. I heard it from the guest room. One clean ring, no repetition, and by the time I had pulled on my cardigan and reached the top of the stairs, I could already hear Derek's voice at the front door, thanking someone. The particular tone he used for transactions, efficient, wrapped up quickly. When I came downstairs, he was standing in the kitchen doorway with a cream-colored envelope in one hand and his travel mug in the other. He looked at me the way he sometimes did when he was deciding something, a half-second assessment, the kind that happened behind the eyes. "This came for you," he said, and set it on the counter. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked out the front door. I looked at the envelope without touching it for a moment. My name was on the front, Beverly Harmon, in the same block print I had seen before. Return address, First Coastal Bank of Georgia. I picked it up and carried it to the dining room table. Not the kitchen counter, not the living room. The table where there was room to lay pages flat and read them properly the way Gerald had always insisted documents deserved to be read. I opened it without asking anyone's permission. 3 pages. The same format as before, but this time fully completed, no blank fields, no pending information. Everything filled in. Transfer authorization. Harmon Family Trust. Transfer amount $380,000. Destination account Derek W. Harmon personal checking. I read that line twice. Not a joint account, not a business account, not a trust account or an estate fund or any of the other things it might have been dressed up as. Personal checking, his name alone. At the bottom of the 3rd page, a signature line. My name printed beneath it in the same clean typeface. Beverly Ann Harmon, primary beneficiary and trust consent holder. I was still reading when I became aware that someone was standing in the doorway. Derek had come back inside. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not aggressive, not urgent, just present, watching. It's standard estate consolidation, he said. Simplifies the management going forward. Prescott already reviewed it. I set the pages down flat on the table, squared them neatly, and looked up at him. I'll need to confirm that with Prescott directly, I said. Something moved through his expression there and gone. Of course, he said. Take your time. He said it the way people say things they've already planned the next step around. Then he picked up his briefcase from where he'd set it just inside the door, and this time he left for good. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway. Then I went back to the pages. The first page was the authorization itself. The second page was a cover letter on law firm letterhead, and it was the second page that stopped me. Not because of anything it said, but because of the firm's name at the top. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't Prescott's practice. It wasn't anything I had seen before in any of the trust documentation. I read the firm's name carefully. Then I picked up my phone and photographed all 3 pages methodically, one at a time, making sure the text was legible. Then I sat down and called Prescott. He answered on the second ring. I read him the firm's name from the letterhead. There was a brief pause on his end, the kind that means someone is choosing their words with care. That firm, he said, handles one primary area of practice. Another pause. Family dissolution. The coffee maker beeped in the kitchen, the ordinary sound of an ordinary morning. They're divorce attorneys, I said. Yes, Prescott said. They are. He let that sit for just a moment before continuing. Beverly, I want to give you some guidance right now, and I need you to hear it clearly. Do not confront anyone directly. Do not indicate that you know anything beyond what they've told you. What you need to do is decline to sign, no explanation, required no argument. Simply say you need more time to review it. That's your right as consent holder. That's always been your right. And then I asked. And then let the situation develop on its own terms. Events have a way of arranging themselves when the right pieces are in place. He paused. Are you all right? I thought about that for a moment. I'm clear, I said. That's better than all right. I put the phone down and sat at the dining room table for a while. The house around me was doing its ordinary things, the refrigerator cycling on and off a bird, conducting some private argument in the backyard, the sound of Natalie moving around upstairs. In an hour, the children would come down for breakfast. In 2 hours, the morning would look like every other morning from the outside. I folded the photographed documents back into their envelope and carried it to my room where I set it in the nightstand drawer beneath Gerald's folded letter. Then I went to the kitchen, poured my coffee, and began making breakfast as though it were any other day, because that was what Prescott had said to do, and because Gerald, who had known me for 45 years, had left me in the care of a man whose advice I had decided to trust completely. I would not sign. I had the photographs, and when dinner was over and the house had settled into its evening quiet, I picked up my phone one more time. 2 words. That was all it took. It's time. I had the photographs. I had made my decision. And what was about to happen at that dinner table, none of them were ready for it. If you're still with me, drop "I'm still here." In the comments, I want to know you're watching when everything falls apart. A quick note, some details ahead have been shaped for storytelling. If that's not your preference, this is your moment to step away. But if you want to see how it all unraveled, stay with me. That evening, Derek set the table. In the 8 months I had lived in that house, I had never seen him do that. I came downstairs at 6:15 to find the dining room already arranged, placemats, straight glasses filled with water. The good napkins folded into neat triangles rather than the paper ones the children usually used on weekday evenings. There were candles on the sideboard that hadn't been there at breakfast unlit, but present the kind of detail that announces intention without declaring it. The children were already seated. Sullivan had his hands folded in his lap the way he did when he sensed formality, and wasn't sure what it required of him. Juniper was watching Derek move between the kitchen and the table with the particular attention of a child who has learned to read rooms. Derek looked up when I came in. "Beverly," he said pleasantly. "Good timing." I took my seat. The food was good. Natalie had made the baked ziti that Juniper requested for birthdays and special occasions, the kind that took most of an afternoon to prepare properly layered and unhurried. The kind of dish that says someone cared enough to spend time on it. There was garlic bread and a green salad, and Derek poured iced tea without being asked, moving around the table with the ease of a man who has choreographed this particular scene and is satisfied with how it's running. To anyone passing by the window, it would have looked like a family enjoying a Friday dinner together. A good Friday. The kind worth remembering. It took me approximately 40 seconds to notice what was beside my plate. The authorization document, all 3 pages clipped together, had been placed to the left of my placemat just inside the outer fork, tucked neatly as though it were a menu or a place card. As though it had always belonged there, as though its presence required no explanation, and expected no comment, as though the most natural thing in the world was to ask a woman to sign away $380. 000 between the salad and the main course. I unfolded my napkin and set it in my lap and did not look at it again. Derek waited until the pasta had been served and the children had been settled before he began. He did it the way he did most things, without preamble, without anything that could be called pressure in tone. Just a smooth and unhurried explanation that had clearly been prepared in advance and rehearsed until it no longer sounded rehearsed. "I wanted to bring Beverly up to speed on some paperwork," he said, addressing the table generally as though this were a matter of mild communal interest rather than anything pointed. "It's straightforward, a consolidation of the trust assets to simplify ongoing management. Standard procedure for estates of this size." He glanced at me with an expression of helpful patience, the expression of a man doing a favor. "The attorneys have already done the review," he continued. "All that's needed is Beverly's signature as the consent holder, which is really just a formality at this point. It protects everyone." He reached for the garlic bread. I waited until he had set it down. "Derek," I said in the same tone I had once used to ask students why their library books were 2 weeks overdue, conversational, unhurried, genuinely curious, "why does this transfer go to your personal account and not back into the trust?" The table did not go silent all at once. It went silent in stages. Sullivan's fork stopped moving first. Then Juniper set hers down slowly and found something to study on the tablecloth, a spot to fold anything that wasn't the adults. Natalie, who had been reaching for the salad, withdrew her hand without taking any and placed it in her lap instead. Derek looked at me for a moment. "It's a structural detail," he said. "The account is used to manage distributions. It's effectively the same as a trust account for operational purposes." "I see," I said. I let a beat pass. Just one. "And can you tell me who Sandra Fielding is?" The silence that followed that question was a different quality entirely. The first silence had been surprise, the table catching its breath. This one had weight, the kind that presses down on a room and changes the temperature of it. Natalie's head came up. It was not a dramatic motion. She didn't startle, didn't knock anything over. She simply raised her eyes from her plate and looked across the table at her husband with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who has just heard a word they weren't expecting in a sentence they thought they understood. The word landing, the sentence rearranging itself around it. Derek set his fork down. When he spoke, his voice was still measured, but something in it had been recalibrated a fraction tighter, a fraction more careful, the way a structure sounds different when one of its supports has shifted. Sandra Fielding is a business contact, he said, a consultant. You wouldn't understand the structure without the full context. I'd like the full context, I said. I've been trying to understand the structure for some time. De Beverly. I also spoke with Prescott Davenport this week, I said. He mentioned that this transfer was never reviewed by his office. The cover letter references a different firm entirely. I picked up my iced tea. I just want to make sure I understand what I'm signing. Derek's jaw tightened. It was the first unrehearsed thing he'd done all evening, the first moment where the performance and the person behind it came slightly apart. He didn't raise his voice. I want to be precise about that. There was no shouting, no dramatic moment where things overturned. He was too controlled for that, and he knew the children were at the table. What happened instead was subtler and in some ways more telling. He simply stopped performing. The pleasantness that had set the table and lit the sideboard candles and poured the iced tea and explained everything so smoothly it didn't disappear exactly. It receded, pulled back like a tide going out. What was underneath it was not anger exactly. It was the particular coldness of a person who has been operating on the assumption that they are the only one in the room who knows what's actually happening and has just discovered not loudly, not dramatically, but with absolute certainty that assumption was wrong. We can discuss the specifics after dinner, he said. Of course, I said. I picked up my fork. The ziti is wonderful, Natalie. Natalie said thank you. Her voice was steady. But she did not look at Derek again for the rest of the meal, and when I glanced at her during the clearing of the plates, I saw the expression I had been watching for without knowing I was watching for it. She wasn't angry. She wasn't frightened. She was doing the arithmetic. Natalie had stopped looking at her husband. I had just said a name nobody at that table was prepared to hear. If this is hitting close to home, type, "I see you, Beverly," in the comments. What came next? The 3 explanations. The silence, the bedroom door closing, none of them saw it coming. Some elements ahead have been dramatized for storytelling. If you'd rather stop here, that's okay. But if you want to know what finally broke, don't go anywhere. Derek pushed back his chair slowly. He had 3 explanations ready. I could tell by the way he straightened his shoulders the posture of a man who is rehearsed. I had seen that posture before, though not on Derek. I had seen it on students who came to the library with excuses for overdue books, the particular uprightness of someone who has prepared their case and is confident in the preparation, who believes that if you deliver a story with enough steadiness, it becomes indistinguishable from fact. The difference was that those students had been 11 years old, and their excuses had at least been creative. Derek's were not. He started with the money. The transfer is part of a private investment structure, he said, standing now at the head of the table, hands resting on the back of his chair. It's more efficient to route the funds through a personal account before distributing to the investment vehicle. That's how the arrangement was set up. I see, I said. Could you show me the offering documents, the prospectus for the investment? A beat. I don't have them on hand, he said. They're with the fund manager. Of course, I said. And the fund manager's name? Another beat, slightly longer. The kind of pause that a prepared person shouldn't need, because a prepared person would have anticipated this question and had the name ready. The pause told me more than any answer would have. I'll get you that information, he said. He moved on before I could ask when. That too was telling. As for Sandra Fielding, he said, and his voice shifted into the same measured register he used when explaining the grocery list protocol, the register of a man managing the temperature of a conversation. She's a business consultant. Her firm has worked with several of my projects over the past year. The payments are standard consulting fees. Paid from a personal account? I asked. Not a business account. Her firm prefers that arrangement. He said it without hesitation, which told me he had expected the question and prepared for it specifically. Some smaller consultants operate that way. It simplifies their bookkeeping. 8 payments, I said, every month, each one just under $10,000. Consulting work can be ongoing, Derek said. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who believes that composure is the same as credibility, that if you remain calm enough, present enough, unflustered enough, the person across from you will eventually doubt their own questions. I had met that expression before on different faces in different rooms. It had never worked on me. That's an unusual billing structure, I said pleasantly. He picked up the transfer document from beside my placemat and set it at the center of the table, a small redirect dressed as a practical suggestion. If you have questions about the specifics, we can schedule time with the attorneys. Which attorneys? I asked. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and unfolded the piece of paper I had kept there since that morning. I had written the firm's name down from the letterhead, just the name in my own handwriting, because I'd wanted to be able to read it clearly when the moment came. Without squinting at a photocopy or scrolling through my phone, I had wanted it on paper in my own hand the way Gerald had always written the things that mattered. This firm here, I read the name aloud. Natalie had been standing by the kitchen doorway through most of this exchange, still and quiet in the way she went quiet when she was processing something, absorbing information the way she had always absorbed difficult things carefully and completely, without visible reaction until she had finished. When I read the firm's name out loud, the color left her face the way it leaves a room when someone turns off the overhead light, quickly, completely all at once. I watched it happen. I had not wanted to be the one to cause it. I had known when I wrote the name on that piece of paper that reading it aloud would cost her something. But some things once set in motion finish themselves. The name was already in the room. It had been in the room since dinner. Derek's composure didn't shatter. It didn't crumble dramatically. What happened was smaller than that and worse. A single fault line appeared in the careful surface of it, a fraction of a second, where his eyes moved away from mine before he could stop them. Just a fraction. Just long enough. It was enough. Natalie stepped forward from the doorway. Not toward me, not toward the table. Toward him. She stopped a few feet away and stood there with the stillness of someone who has made a decision about what they need to know and has decided to ask it directly, regardless of what the answer might cost them. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that I almost didn't hear it. Derek? A pause that held everything. Is there someone else? The question sat in the room. He did not answer immediately. I counted not intentionally just the way time moves slowly in certain moments, stretching itself out, and his silence lasted longer than any denial should have needed. A denial is a reflex. It comes before the thought. What takes time is the calculation, the weighing of options, the measuring of exits, the assessment of what is already known and what can still be managed. When he finally spoke, he said her name. Natalie. That's not an answer, she said. Sullivan had appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, drawn by the change in the air, the way children are not fully understanding the specifics, but understanding the shape of it, the weight of it, the way a room feels when the adults in it have stopped pretending. He looked at his father, then at his mother. Then he crossed the dining room without a word, 7 years old in his school clothes, with his hair still slightly messed from the afternoon, and sat down in the chair beside mine. He placed his small hand over my hand on the table. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply let his hand be there and kept mine still beneath it. Derek said something low to Natalie. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone, which was the tone of a man trying to find purchase on a surface that has become too smooth to hold. She turned and walked out of the dining room through the living room toward the back of the house. Derek followed her. The bedroom door closed not loudly, but with the specific finality of a door that means to stay shut, the sound of a conversation that has moved somewhere private, because it has to, not because either person chose it. Sullivan and I sat at the table in the remains of the Friday dinner. The pasta had gone cold. The garlic bread sat in its basket, half eaten, the way dinner looks, when a meal has been interrupted by something more important than eating. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator cycled on and then off again, indifferent to all of it. He didn't ask me anything, and I didn't offer anything. He was 7 years old, and he understood more than 7-year-olds should ever have to. And the best thing I could do for him in that moment was simply be there, a hand under his hand, a presence that wasn't going anywhere, a person who would still be in that chair when the door at the end of the hall finally opened again. We had sat like this before, Sullivan and I, on quieter evenings at this same table, with nothing particular to say to each other. But this was different. This was the sitting together that means something, the kind that a child will carry forward into their life without necessarily knowing why certain moments feel like ground. From behind the closed door at the end of the hall, voices. Low, indistinct, the way conversations sound through walls, when you can't make out the words but can hear everything in the tone. I did not try to listen. I already knew the shape of what was being said. Some truths, once they've been named out loud, don't allow the room to stay the same. You can close a door, lower your voice, choose your words carefully. But the name has been spoken. The question has been asked. And the silence that answered it, that particular weighted silence, had already told everyone at the table everything they needed to know. Sullivan's hand was warm in mine. We sat together and waited for whatever came next. I had not been sleeping. I'd been lying in the dark with Gerald's letter on the nightstand beside me, not reading it, just knowing it was there. The way you keep a hand near something you might need and listening to the house settle into its late-night sounds. The particular creaks and contractions of a house doing its invisible work, the sounds you only hear when everything else has gone quiet. The children had gone to bed hours earlier. The back of the house had gone quiet sometime after 10. I had been waiting, though I couldn't have said exactly what for. Some part of me had known she would come. Some part of me had been keeping the lamp on low for exactly that reason. When I heard her stop outside my door, I sat up. Mom. Her voice was low, uncertain, in a way I hadn't heard from Natalie since she was a teenager standing outside this same kind of door in a different house, in a different life. The voice of someone who isn't sure they have the right to knock but has run out of reasons not to. Come in, I said. She was still dressed, hadn't changed out of the clothes she'd worn to dinner, which told me she hadn't slept either. She looked the way people look after a long cry in a private room, not undone, but emptied out. Quieter than usual in her face, as though something that had been held at tension for a long time had finally released and left a different kind of stillness in its place. She stood in the doorway for a moment as though checking whether the invitation was real. And then she came in and sat in the wingback chair in the corner, Gerald's chair, and pulled her knees up the way she had when she was small. I remembered that particular posture from 100 Nights in Savannah. Natalie in the reading chair in our living room, knees drawn up, making herself smaller than she was. She had done it when she was worried about something and didn't know how to begin saying so. Some gestures never leave us no matter how old we get. I moved to sit on the edge of the bed facing her. Neither of us spoke immediately. The house around us was doing its quiet midnight things a branch, somewhere outside the low hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away. There was a particular quality to the silence between us that was different from the silences of the previous months. Less distance in it. More weight. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full of everything that was about to be said. She spoke first. He told me the trust money was ours to manage, she said. Not an accusation, a recitation the way you repeat something you've been carrying a long time and have finally decided to set down. He said it was what your financial advisor had arranged, that you'd agreed to it, that it was just how things worked with older estates. I waited. I believed him. She said it simply without apology or self-defense. I didn't ask to see documentation. I didn't call Prescott. I believed him because it was easier than not believing him and because I didn't know enough to know what questions to ask. She paused. I've been sitting with that for the last several hours, the not knowing what to ask. I keep trying to decide whether that makes it better or worse. She looked at me with an expression I recognized, because I had worn it myself in the months after Gerald left, the specific exhaustion of someone who has just understood that a long period of confusion was not confusion at all. It was simply not having been told the truth. How long have you known? She asked. Long enough, I said. I'm sorry I didn't find a way to come to you sooner. She shook her head. You couldn't have. I wouldn't have. She stopped, started again. I wouldn't have been ready to hear it. The crying when it came was not dramatic. That was the thing about Natalie. She had always cried the way private people cry, with very little sound and a quality of concentration, as though the grief required the same focus as anything else she did. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, and then she lowered it, and then she simply let it happen. She didn't apologize for it. She didn't try to explain it. She just let it move through her the way weather moves through completely, and then done. I moved from the bed to the ottoman in front of her chair and took both her hands. We sat like that for a while. When she was ready, she told me the rest of it. Not everything, some of it. She was still assembling herself, still sorting into the right order, but enough. No bank account of her own for 4 years. Every purchase cleared through Derek's card, every household expense managed through his accounts, every dollar accounted for by someone else. She had not thought of it as control, she said. She had thought of it as a system. She said those words carefully, the way you say something you've just realized is more significant than you initially understood. He said it was more efficient, she said. One account, fewer fees. I thought it made sense. A pause. I thought that was just how it worked. When you trust someone completely, you stop asking whether the system is fair. You just operate inside it. And then one day you reach into your own purse for your own card, and there's nothing there, and you've stopped noticing that there's nothing there. And that's when you should be frightened, but you're not because you've normalized it so completely that it just feels like Tuesday. I know, I said, because I did. Because I had spent months not asking questions about files in a gray cabinet and money in accounts I didn't understand. And I understood exactly how a person arrives at Tuesday without noticing the distance they've traveled. I told her about the trust the way Prescott had told me plainly without softening and without dramatics. I told her Gerald had established it in 2009 that the consent right clause meant no significant distribution could move without my signature, that this had been a deliberate choice her father had made with specific intention. He knew, Natalie asked. He knew the kinds of situations that can develop. I said carefully. He didn't know specifics. He just knew that the most important thing he could do was make sure I had something no one could take away from me. She was quiet for a moment, looking at our joined hands. He was protecting you, she said. He was protecting both of us, I said. In his way, from a distance. She looked up. I never really understood how he thought about things until just now. That landed somewhere quiet in my chest, the particular ache of a true thing arriving a little late, but still intact. I did not tell her about Black Mountain that night. Not because I was keeping it from her, but because some things need their own moment, their own space, separate from everything else that has to be absorbed first. She had enough to carry tonight. The weight of 4 years of slow diminishment, the weight of a name she hadn't known until dinner, the weight of her father's love arriving in the form of legal documents and careful clauses, all of that needed room to settle before anything new was added to it. The house in the mountains would keep. It had waited this long. It could wait a few more days. What mattered at 2 a.m. in a kitchen in Charleston was this. My daughter was sitting across from me and telling me the truth, and I was holding her hands. And for the first time in longer than I could measure, we were not on opposite sides of something. We talked until the kitchen windows went from black to the first pale gray of early morning. Not about money, not about documents, not about what came next. We talked about Gerald, the things he said, the way he moved through a room, the particular sound of his voice on Sunday mornings, reading the newspaper out loud to no one in particular. We talked about the house on Oleander Street and the magnolia tree that was probably standing in the February dark right now with no one to see it blooming anyway. It was the first real conversation we had managed in years. Not the first conversation we had talked over the years the way people talk when they love each other, but have gotten slightly out of the habit of being honest. This was different. This was the kind of talking that leaves you lighter than you were before it. I kept the secret of Black Mountain, the way you keep a gift before the right moment, held carefully privately with the particular tenderness of something that isn't ready to be given yet. We were still at the kitchen table when the sun came up. Natalie made coffee. I didn't say anything, neither did she. Some silences are comfortable. This was one of them, the particular quiet that settles between two people who have said everything that needed saying and have arrived somewhere in the small hours at solid ground. We watched the light change outside the kitchen window, the pale gray becoming gold, becoming the full white of a July morning in South Carolina, and we drank our coffee. And neither of us felt the need to fill the air. There is a kind of closeness that only happens after honesty, not the comfortable closeness of people who have never had anything difficult between them, but the harder, steadier kind that comes from having finally said the true thing and survived it together. The children came down at 7:30. Natalie made eggs. I set the table. Nobody mentioned the night before, and the children, in the intuitive way children have of reading a room and adjusting, seemed to understand that the morning called for ordinary things. Sullivan ate his breakfast with the focused quiet of a boy who has learned that some mornings require simply showing up and being present, nothing more. Juniper asked if we had orange juice. We did. She poured a glass for Sullivan without being asked, which I noted and said nothing about. By 9 o'clock, the house had that particular hush of a Saturday morning that has been cleared of its usual business. Derek had not come downstairs. By 9:30, Prescott's car was in the driveway. He came in, the way he did everything without rush, without excess, carrying a leather folder that I had come to recognize as the one that held things of consequence. He shook my hand. He shook Natalie's hand with the same steady gravity as though he had known her father long enough to extend that care naturally to her. He accepted a cup of coffee and sat down at the same kitchen table where we had spent the night, and he opened the folder. "I want to walk you both through what happens next," he said, in plain terms. He looked at Natalie when he said both, and something in her expression shifted a small recalibration. The look of a person being included in something they hadn't expected to be included in. She straightened slightly, set her coffee down, gave him her full attention. "All right," she said. Prescott laid it out in 3 parts the way a man who has practiced law for 4 decades lays things out clearly in order, without dramatizing what didn't need dramatizing and without softening what did. The first was the notice of breach of fiduciary duty. His office had prepared it the previous week, and it had been filed that morning with both the court and First Coastal Bank of Georgia. Derek's authority as limited trustee was formally suspended pending a temporary restraining order he expected the court to issue within 1 to 2 weeks. His access to the trust account was frozen as of this morning. "He can challenge it," Prescott said. "He has the right to do that. But the documentation is thorough and the burden of proof will fall on him." He paused briefly. "In my experience, when the documentation is this complete, challenges of this kind tend to resolve in a predictable direction." I nodded. "Second," he said, "the $380,000 transfer. Since you never signed the authorization, the bank has no legal basis to proceed. That amount stays in the trust. The transfer is void." He paused. "It was always void the moment you declined to sign. That consent, right your husband built into the trust, that one clause is the reason that money is still where it belongs." Across the table, Natalie was listening with the focused stillness of someone taking a final exam, absorbing every word, filing it carefully, letting nothing pass without being understood. "And the 80,000, I asked. "That is a civil matter," Prescott said. "My office is filing suit to recover the full amount plus applicable interest and legal fees. I want to be honest with you about the timeline." He set his coffee down and looked at me steadily. "That will take months, Beverly, possibly longer. Courts don't rush for anyone, and recovery in cases like this depends on what assets are available to attach. We will pursue it fully, but it won't be quick." "Take all the time you need," I said. "Do it right." He looked at me for a moment, the way people sometimes do when they expected more resistance, more urgency, more grief, more demand for speed. And then he nodded once, with something that looked like respect. Then he reached into the leather folder and produced a document I recognized, the deed. Heavy paper official seals the formal language of property transfer that Gerald had always said was designed to be impossible to misread. He set it on the table in front of me. 412 Ridgeline Drive, Black Mountain, North Carolina, he said. "Held in your name, Beverly Ann Harmon, sole owner. No lien, no cosigner, no encumbrance of any kind." He turned the document and indicated a line near the bottom. "Gerald wrote a specific instruction into the transfer terms. I'll read it as it was written." He put on his glasses. This property transfers to Beverly upon my passing, no other signature required. It is hers entirely. No one else's name belongs on this deed, and no one else's permission is needed for anything she chooses to do with it." He took his glasses off and set them beside his coffee cup. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the backyard, cycling through songs the way it always did on summer mornings, borrowing other birds' voices and making them its own. Natalie was looking at the table. I could see her working through it, the fact of the house, the care it represented, the years of quiet planning that had produced this single piece of paper. Her father had done this. Her father had thought this far ahead, had looked at the shape of what might happen, and had built an answer to it years before it arrived. Then Prescott reached into the folder one more time. "Your father also left something for you," he said, and he slid a small envelope across the table toward Natalie. Her name on the front in Gerald's handwriting. The careful, slightly left-leaning script she had grown up watching filled grocery lists and birthday cards and the margins of engineering manuals. I turned toward the window, not because I needed to look at anything in particular, just because some moments belong entirely to the person inside them. And the best thing you can do is give them the space to be inside it fully. I heard the soft tear of an envelope being opened. I heard Natalie take a slow breath, the kind you take before reading something you already sense will matter. I heard the particular quiet of someone reading words that were written only for them in a voice they will never hear again, but can still find on the page. Then I heard her exhale one long, unsteady breath, the kind that carries more than air. When I looked back, she was looking at the paper in her hands. The tears on her face were different from the ones I had seen the night before. Not grief, not exhaustion. Not the desperate, wrung-out crying of someone who has been holding something too long and finally put it down. Something closer to being found. The particular expression of a person who has just been told in their father's own words that they were seen clearly and loved without condition. By the time Prescott left, I was holding the deed to a house I had never seen, in a town I had never visited, with my name printed on it in clean black type. Derek's access to the trust was suspended. The $380,000 was secure. The process of recovering what had been taken was underway, slow as it might be. Gerald had built all of this not in the last months of his life, not in a hurry or a panic, but over years, clause by clause, document by document. A property purchased quietly in 2020 when he must have already understood that time was something he had less of than he wished. A letter sealed and left with a trusted attorney. A deed with no other name on it. A small envelope set aside for a daughter who would need her father's words at exactly the right moment. He had seen far enough ahead to prepare for a morning he would not be present for. That was the most Gerald thing I could imagine to be useful from a distance, to arrange things so carefully that his absence would hurt less than it might have. I looked out the window at the July morning, the light full and clear now, the way southern summer light gets when the day has committed to itself, and thought about the suitcase in my bedroom closet, the large one, the one I hadn't opened since the move from Savannah. It was time to start thinking about what to put in it. 3 days later, my car was packed. Juniper and Sullivan stood on the front porch in their pajamas because I was leaving early before school. The morning was still cool, one of those rare July mornings that hasn't yet remembered its summer, with a low mist sitting in the yards and the birds carrying on their usual business in the hedges. The kind of morning that makes a place look its best, softened at the edges, everything slightly gentler than it actually is. The children looked young standing there together, in their pajamas with their hair not yet combed and their faces still soft with sleep. They looked exactly their age, which was something I was grateful for, because in the preceding weeks they had both been asked without anyone saying so directly to look older than they were. I hugged Sullivan first. He held on a beat longer than usual. He didn't say anything. Sullivan rarely said anything when he meant the most, and I had learned to read him accordingly. Then Juniper. "Are you coming back?" she asked, direct the way she asked everything. "I'll be a phone call away," I said, "and a 4-hour drive, that's not so far." She considered this with the solemn practicality of a 10-year-old doing real calculations, weighing the actual distance against what distance meant, which are two different measurements entirely. Georgia painted buntings migrate sometimes, I said. So do the ones from North Carolina. Sometimes they go the same direction. That made her smile small, private, just for the two of us. She tucked it away quickly the way she tucked most things she didn't want examined too closely. But I saw it and I kept it. Sullivan reached into the pocket of his pajama top and held out a folded piece of paper. I opened it carefully. A house on a hill drawn in crayon. Green slopes, a wide porch, a sky with clouds that had faces the way children draw clouds. And standing in the open doorway, a woman with gray hair and a cardigan looking out. He had drawn the mountains behind the house in blue and gray, layered the way a child layers colors when they are trying to get something exactly right. I folded it back along its creases and tucked it into my coat pocket. I did not trust myself to say anything. So I said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Some things are too full for words, and trying to put them into sentences only diminishes them. I drove northwest out of Charleston before 7, while the city was still deciding whether to wake up. Past Columbia, the land began to change. The flatness gave way to roll, and the roll gave way to something more deliberate, the ground lifting toward the Blue Ridge the way a sentence lifts before it arrives at its point. I had driven this stretch of highway once before, years ago, on a trip Gerald and I had taken, without any particular destination. He had driven then. I had watched the same ground rise from the passenger seat and thought it was beautiful without understanding why it mattered. Now I was the one driving, and it mattered in a way I could feel in my hands on the wheel. By the time I crossed into North Carolina, the mountains were ahead of me, blue-gray and patient against the morning sky. Patient the way old things are. Patient, not waiting for anything in particular. Just enduring in the particular way that things endure when they have been there long enough to know that most urgency is temporary. The GPS took me through Black Mountain's main street, a hardware store, a bakery with a hand-lettered sign, a farmer's market being set up in a parking lot on the south end. A man in overalls was arranging tomatoes on a folding table. A woman with 2 small children was negotiating the price of something wrapped in brown paper. People moving at the pace of a place that has nowhere urgent to be and has made a kind of peace with that. Ridgeline Drive turned uphill from the east edge of town. Number 412 sat back from the road behind a row of hemlocks, modest and well-made wide front porch windows, catching the morning light and holding it in the unhurried way that good windows do. And in the side yard, younger than the one I had left in Savannah, maybe 15 years old, still growing into itself, its branches not yet wide enough to offer real shade, a magnolia. I sat in the car and looked at it for a long moment. Gerald had planted it. He'd come here to this town, to this yard, and put a magnolia in the ground for me to find. He had known I would need to see one. He had known it the way he knew most things about me, without being told, without being asked. The key fit the front lock without any persuasion. Inside the house was clean and quiet, and ready, the particular readiness of a space that has been cared for in anticipation of being used, aired out, and settled, waiting without impatience. 3 bedrooms, a living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that faced north toward the mountain. I walked through each room slowly the way you walk through something you want to memorize before you start living in it and stop being able to see it clearly. The floors were wide planked oak. The windows were deep-silled and generous. Every room caught light from a different angle at a different hour, which meant the house would never look the same twice. In the kitchen on the windowsill above the sink, there was a small frame, just one photograph placed deliberately where it would be seen every morning. Gerald and me at Lake Lure, summer of 1987. We were both laughing, I couldn't remember at what, though I remembered the trip clearly. The way the water had looked that afternoon, green and still. The way he had burned the back of his neck because he'd forgotten sunscreen, which he never forgot again after that. He must have had a copy made sometime in the years after and brought it here when he came to arrange things. He had set it on that windowsill in a kitchen in a town I'd never visited for the morning I finally arrived. I stood in front of it for a long time. The 2 people in that photograph were laughing at something neither of us could remember, and that seemed in this moment exactly right. Eventually, I went out to the porch. The mountains were fully visible now. The mist burned off the ridgeline sharp against a sky that had settled into honest blue. I sat in one of the two chairs. There were two, which was its own kind of message. Gerald's particular way of saying someone will sit beside you eventually, and I thought about the word that had been following me since I pulled up the drive. Dignity. Not the kind you perform for other people. The kind you protect by telling the truth when silence would have been easier. The kind that asks the questions, opens the envelope, makes the phone call, declines to sign the document that should never have been placed beside your dinner plate. The kind that doesn't require an audience because it was never about being seen. It was about being able to look at yourself clearly at the end of the day and recognize the person looking back. Gerald had known that about me before I did. He had known I was the kind of person who needed to be reminded of her own ground, not because I was weak, but because kindness can look like yielding, and the two are not the same thing. He had watched me yield gracefully my whole life and had loved me for it, and had also quietly built a door so that yielding would never cost me everything. He had spent years building me that door. I had finally walked through it. The civil case would take months. The $80,000 would travel a long road before it came back. I had learned somewhere in the months just past that patience is not the same as passivity, that waiting with intention is entirely different from waiting because you don't know what else to do. I had Sullivan's drawing in my coat pocket, a photograph on a windowsill, a magnolia in the yard that would need another decade before it reached full height, which meant I would be here to watch it grow, which was its own kind of promise. A porch facing the mountains and two chairs and a town with a hardware store on the main street and a farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I had a door with my name on it. So if you're out there tonight watching from a porch or a kitchen table or a guest room that doesn't quite feel like yours, I want you to hear this from a woman who spent too many months not asking the right questions you are allowed to ask. You are allowed to read before you sign. You are allowed to call the attorney whose name is on the card someone pressed into your hand and told you to keep. You are allowed to take up exactly as much space as belongs to you, not the space someone else has decided is appropriate, not the space that makes things easier for everyone around you. Yours. All of it. The door Gerald built for me took 45 years to find. Yours might be closer than you think. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And has anyone ever built you a door? Looking back at this family story, I want to be honest with you about something I'm not proud of. I waited too long. I signed things I didn't read. I handed over my keys not just to a house but to my own life because grief had made me quiet, and quiet felt easier than asking questions. I told myself I was being flexible, being gracious, being the kind of woman who doesn't make things harder than they need to be. What I was actually being was invisible. Don't do what I did. Don't mistake silence for kindness. Don't confuse trusting someone with surrendering your right to understand what you're agreeing to. Don't let exhaustion make decisions that belong to your clearest, most awake self. I handed over 45 years of financial security in less than 20 minutes at a dining room table with a pen someone else had already uncapped for me. I signed where the marks were. I asked nothing. That is the part of this family story I will carry with me for the rest of my life, not as shame, but as instruction. Because if I had asked one question, read one page, made one phone call 3 months earlier, the road would have looked very different. This story taught me that love doesn't ask you to stop thinking. Gerald loved me more completely than I have words for, and that love came with a locked gray cabinet, a consent clause written into a legal document, and a folded note hidden inside a bank envelope addressed to my name. He didn't leave me flowers. He left me protection. Real love prepares. It protects. It leaves you something no one else can touch, negotiate, or sign away while you're too tired to notice. The dad revenge in this story was never loud. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic moment of public triumph. Gerald's dad revenge was built quietly over 15 years in documents and deeds and a house on a hill in the Blue Ridge Mountains with my name on the title and 2 chairs waiting on the porch. Patient, deliberate, completely undetectable until the moment it mattered most. The most powerful dad revenge I have ever witnessed was simply a man who refused quietly, consistently across a decade and a half to leave the people he loved without a door of their own. I believe God gives us what we need, sometimes the grand and obvious gestures, more often through the quiet work of people who love us enough to think further ahead than we can see. If this family story left you with anything, let it be this: you are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to read every page before you sign it. You are allowed to take up exactly as much space as belongs to you and not 1 inch less. You are allowed to have a door with your name on it. Thank you for walking this road with me all the way to the end. I'd love to know what you're thinking. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done standing in Beverly's shoes, that dining room, the moment everything became clear? I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, subscribing means you won't miss what comes next. One last note: this is a work of fiction. While the emotions draw from deeply human experiences, names, characters, and events have been created for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real people or situations is coincidental. If this style of content isn't for you, no hard feelings. There's something for everyone. .ro.
That's the full story. I appreciate you being here. I will see you in next one.